The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4587, a bill to impose targeted sanctions on individuals responsible for carrying out or ordering human rights abuses against the citizens of Venezuela and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Ross-Leighton, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on this bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to place into the record letters between the chairman of the committees of referral on this bill.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The woman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 4587, the Venezuelan Human Rights and Democracy Protection Act. This bill has received bipartisan support from many of my colleagues in the House and was passed more than 2 weeks ago by our Foreign Affairs Committee. I would like to thank Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, Subcommittee Chairman Salmon, and Ranking Member Sears for working with my office to craft the legislation that is before us this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, we are here today to condemn the ongoing human rights abuses being committed in Venezuela and to answer the cries of the people of Venezuela. On February 12, 2014, also known in Venezuela as National Youth Day, students began protesting in several cities against Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro's inability to stem violent crime, his undemocratic actions, and a rapidly deteriorating economy marked by high inflation and shortages of consumer goods. Since then, these students and the Venezuelan people as a whole have been met with intimidation, with violence, with imprisonment, simply for calling for the respect of human rights and democratic change. One example is the case of Leopoldo Lopez, a pro-democracy leader who continues to be imprisoned at a military facility on trumped-up charges by Maduro in an effort by Maduro to silence his many critics. The case of Maria Corina Machado is another example. This courageous woman, a member of the Venezuelan National Assembly until just recently, has stood up for the people of Venezuela and for drawing attention to the abuses being committed by the autocrat. She was stripped of her legislative seat. Since the protests began, Mr. Speaker, there have been 42 people killed, nearly 60 reported cases of torture, more than 2,000 people unjustly detained, and hundreds more injured. And throughout this crisis, the so-called dialogue discussions with Maduro and UNASUR has provided no results, no actions, no concessions, and the innocent are still being imprisoned. And just 2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, 250 teenage protesters, ones who had camped out in the public square to protest, were rounded up and thrown in jail. Teenagers. But the problems in Venezuela go beyond these protests. Venezuela has now become one of the most dangerous countries in Latin America. According to press reports, between January 2014 and April 2014, there were over 4,500 homicides in Venezuela. That is a staggering statistic, Mr. Speaker. This call for freedom and democracy in Venezuela did not just start in February, and it's a shame that it has taken the events of these past few months for us to get active about the plight of the Venezuelan people. The struggle for freedom in Venezuela has been ongoing for over a decade due to the oppressive policies put forth by the late Hugo Chavez, which have now continued under his hand-picked successor. The legislation before us, Mr. Speaker, is very direct and very clear. It seeks to target Venezuelan officials by denying them visas to enter the United States, blocking property, freezing assets, and prohibiting financial transactions to members of the Venezuelan regime who are responsible for the commission of serious human rights abuses against the people of Venezuela. Very clear, very direct. The United States Congress must stand ready to act on the calls of freedom and democracy around the globe. And the Venezuelan people have sent us a distress signal for help. Today, we answer that call by condemning the actions taken by the Maduro regime and showing our support to the people of Venezuela who are seeking liberty, freedom, human rights, and justice. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentlewoman reserves. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 4587, the Venezuelan Human Rights and Democracy Protection Act, and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Recognize.
I would first like to thank Congresswoman Ross-Lehtinen for authoring this legislation and for her dedication to these important issues. The eyes of this Congress and the international community are on Venezuela and President Nicolas Maduro and his security forces as they crack down on peaceful protesters. It's an absolute tragedy that 42 people have been killed in protests throughout the country. I'm also troubled that opposition leader Leopoldo Lopez remains in jail on charges while many others have been unjustly detained by the Maduro government. I'm grateful for President Obama and Secretary Kerry's strong statements condemning the government's reprehensible actions. Let me say that all of us in Congress want nothing more than a peaceful resolution to this conflict. It was disappointing when negotiation between the Maduro government and the opposition broke down, and I hope that these talks can be revived. In March, the House of Representatives passed a resolution which encouraged a process of dialogue between the government of Venezuela and the political opposition to end the violence. I continue to believe that the dialogue is the best way out of this crisis. In the meantime, the legislation that we are considering today makes it clear that the United States will not turn a blind eye to human rights violations. This bill has been crafted to impose targeted sanctions on human rights violators in Venezuela, while not harming average Venezuelans who are already suffering as a result of terrible economic mismanagement by their country's leaders. While the Venezuelan government might try to say otherwise, let us be clear. There is not a single provision in this bill that would negatively affect the average Venezuelan. This bill does not touch the Venezuelan oil sector or other parts of the country's economy. Instead, the Venezuelan Human Rights and Democracy Protection Bill revokes visas and freezes assets of human rights violators. Finally, it's important to note that this bill gives President Obama a great deal of flexibility to respond to events on the ground in Venezuela. Each and every sanction in this bill can be waived by the President at any time. I would also point out, Mr. Speaker, that it's important, as I mentioned when this came up in committee, as the gentlewoman will remember, it's important that the United States send a strong signal in Latin America. Although we understand that each of the Latin American countries is distinct and different and all have different histories, we witnessed in the 1960s to the 1980s many thousands of students who disappeared, who were removed by their governments from their homes because of the protests that were going on in those countries at the time. And we want to make sure that that never happens again. And this bill is important in ensuring that the Venezuelan government understands that the United States is watching and that we'll make sure that something like that doesn't happen again. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations.
And gentleman from New Jersey
is recognized
my good
for
friend
2 minutes. For yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the Venezuela Human Rights and Democracy Protection Act, and to thank my distinguished colleague, Chairwoman Ileana Ross-Lehtinen, for her bold leadership in calling attention to the deplorable human rights situation in Venezuela, and for creating this meaningful diplomatic tool to assist the Venezuelan people in resisting tyranny, first the tyranny imposed by Hugo Chavez, and now that of his understudy in oppression, Nicolas Maduro. At its core, this important initiative authorizes targeted sanctions to those who are responsible for violence and abuse, namely members of the Maduro regime. The regime's silencing of democracy advocates such as Leopoldo Lopez is a violation of fundamental human rights and is an example of what makes this piece of legislation so fitting and so necessary. I also support the bill's redirection of funds towards supporting civil society groups in Venezuela involved in promoting respect for democracy and fundamental freedoms, most importantly, respect for the right to life, expression, and the right of religious liberty. Indeed, I want to underscore the Church's role as a voice independent of the state of Venezuela and how it has been unafraid to speak up on behalf of the oppressed and those protesting injustice. The Maduro regime has sought to silence the Church, which remains a force independent of the government and a witness to the truth. The House of Representatives honors and deeply respects the key role that the Church and faith-based civil society groups are playing in the fight for democracy and human rights in Venezuela. As we all hope to see a free and democratic Venezuela, I strongly urge my colleagues to support the Ross-Leighton legislation, H.R. 4587, and yield back.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Messer, a member of the Committee on Financial Services.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this important bipartisan bill to promote human rights in Venezuela. I want to commend my colleague, Chairwoman Ross-Leighton, for bringing this important measure forward. It makes clear that as a nation, we do not condone recent human rights abuses against Venezuelans as they fight for democratic change. Venezuelans speaking out for basic rights and freedoms, such as the ability to speak freely and live free from intimidation and violence, have been harassed, intimidated, threatened, and killed as a result of their desire to determine their own destiny. Just this month, 41 people have been killed, over 100 injured, and 60 tortured in Venezuela in response to pro-democracy demonstrations. These are alarming statistics, and action must be taken to prevent this violence and hold the perpetrators accountable. This legislation does that by placing sanctions on those in President Maduro's government who are responsible for this violence against those exercising their legitimate rights. I urge all of my colleagues to support this important bipartisan measure, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back.
I will reserve. Thank you.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York, my colleague, Mr. Meeks of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I come to the floor today to oppose H.R. 4587, the Venezuelan Human Rights and Democracy Protection Act. And while I'm deeply troubled by the violence that erupted in Venezuela at the onset of protests months ago, and I join all of the people of Venezuela in mourning the loss of many lives, I also join all of the people of Venezuela in the desire to see peaceful protests and a peaceful outcome, and that violence by anyone and everyone cease. I remain committed to doing everything in my power to support a positive outcome in that nation. But I believe vehemently that unilateral action by the United States is not the answer. And that is why this bill is not the right step to take. I know that there are high emotions on all sides of this issue, and I understand why. But the House should not act emotionally. It should act judiciously. This bill does not advance U.S. interests. It will not help the people of Venezuela, and it sends the message to our regional allies that we don't care much about what they think. And these are allies. These are our friends. Moreover, the Obama administration has the authority to do what this bill calls for right now. And the administration has shown its willingness to use its authority. So what then is our objective? Is it intended to push Venezuela to the brink? What would that do for the Venezuelan people and the region? Now, I've spoken to all of our major allies in the region, and I've yet to hear any support by them for sanctions. But there is strong support for multilateral engagement. Our allies do not want to see the situation in Venezuela worsen. The unilateral sanctions bill we are considering today is misguided in that it is an unfortunate reminder of the history of U.S. arrogance in the Western Hemisphere. We have a legacy in the Americas that is riddled with long-lasting consequences. That legacy has left us with a trust deficit. Today, we are considering a bill that does nothing to build that trust. Our standing in our own hemisphere will never improve unless or until we build that trust. While we pursue these sanctions, our allies are actively supporting dialogue. Members of this very body have made it a point to denounce and even condemn some regional organizations. Yet one of those organizations, along with the Vatican, has managed to be the facilitator of engagement between some in the opposition and some in the government of Venezuela. UNASUR, in its mediation efforts, continues to urge dialogue between all parties, and it is my sincere hope that dialogue can be successful. But at moments like this, I wonder if we prefer, thank you, just need 30 seconds.
1 minute.
It is my sincere hope that dialogue can be successful. But at moments like this, I hope that we understand that unilateral sanctions would be another policy mistake, a costly mistake that we can and should avoid. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we're gathered here because we believe we must speak for those who cannot speak freely, because our Venezuelan brothers and sisters are engaged in a critical battle for freedom and democracy against a brutal enemy. And we're gathered here because even as we enjoy the freedoms to assemble and express our beliefs, we want our brothers and sisters in Venezuela to enjoy this and other basic liberties. Millions of people throughout the country have expressed themselves in the past 3 weeks in support of democratic change. But the Maduro regime has responded with tear gas, with rubber bullets, and even live ammunition, killing at least 42 and injuring hundreds and unjustly detaining countless others. We must act, because democracy and human rights aren't issues for Venezuelans only. They matter to all of us who seek to advance human dignity, rule of law, justice, and freedom. Tyrants like Maduro fear a small group of committed citizens because they know that they are the only force that has changed history, and we don't have to go far in history to see that even one person can make a difference. With that, Mr. Speaker, we're going to reserve the right to close if Mr. Castro is prepared to yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I am, and I just wanted to say, again, thank you to the Congresswoman, to the Chairman of the committee, Chairman Royce, and Ranking Member Engel. Of course, I'm here, as many others are, to support the bill. There was a counter-argument that Mr. Meeks so eloquently stated. I'm glad he had a chance to voice it, but I do hope that the Congress today will get behind this bill. Thank you, Chairwoman, and with no other speakers, I will yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time, and I'll introduce our closing speaker. I never thought that I would utter these words, but it was a pleasure to work with Mr. Castro. In closing for our side, Mr. Speaker, I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Florida, my legislative brother, Mr. Diaz-Balart, a member of the Committee on Appropriations and a champion of freedom, democracy, and human rights in the Western Hemisphere and around the world. Mr. Diaz-Balart to close.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, sir, very much. I also rise in support of this important resolution, the Venezuelan Human Rights and Democracy Protection Act. And I first, Mr. Speaker, want to start by thanking my dear friend, a tireless champion for human rights and democracy around the world. You know, she has thanked, and rightfully so, a number of people who have helped with this important legislation. But we would not be dealing with this issue on the floor if it wasn't for the tireless effort, the constant tireless struggle and fight and solidarity and efforts of my dear friend, my sister, Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. Those people around the world who are struggling in gulags and struggling for their freedom know that they have in Ileana Ros-Lehtinen a true champion. And once again, we see that leadership here today. Mr. Speaker, since mid-February, the people of Venezuela, led mostly by students, by the way, have risen up to protest the corruption, the food shortages, the crime rates, the alarming repression that have worsened during the Maduro's few months in office, in control. In response to these legitimate, peaceful grievances, Mr. Speaker, the Venezuelan regime, what they've done is they have ordered security forces to brutally crack down, with great force and brutality, crack down on the opposition. They've used unlawful force. They've used severe beatings and beatings of unarmed protesters, mostly students. And by the way, even shooting some of them point blank. They even jailed some of the main opposition leaders on phony charges, Mr. Speaker. And since the protests began, as you've already heard, more than 40 people have been killed. About 3,000 people have been arrested. Many have disappeared, and hundreds more have been injured, Mr. Speaker. And in addition, Maduro's regime has instituted a virtual media blackout, blocking images even over the internet, and, by the way, even expelling journalists, including CNN and NTN. Just this past weekend alone, the Venezuelan regime blocked CNN, a news crew, from covering local elections. Obviously, they don't want anybody there that can show when and how they're stealing those sham elections. And it's shameful, Mr. Speaker, that the Chavez-Maduro regime, the policies, have managed to really get one of the richest economies in Latin America, the largest oil exporter in Latin America, and they've made it, frankly, a poverty-ridden nation. People now face shortages of some of the most basic commodities, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, inflation is about 50% over the last year. So no wonder the people are struggling. Maduro has intensified his intimidation tactics, though, by increasing political arrests, by militarizing his response, using thugs to respond to the peaceful opposition members and students who are in the streets demanding freedom. He's been labeling those unarmed opposition leaders as terrorists and also enemies of the state. We've heard that before, Mr. Speaker. This bill, frankly, just directs our administration to rightly deny visas, to freeze assets and prohibit financial transactions to the members of the Venezuelan regime responsible, Mr. Speaker, those responsible for committing these human rights abuses. So these corrupt cowards, who now have blood on their hands, they shouldn't be allowed to travel to our country while they continue to brutalize their fellow citizens, the students who are in the streets just demanding freedom, the regaining of their sovereignty. It's time to hold these human rights abusers accountable. Those complicit with those egregious acts of human rights violations, Mr. Speaker, they have to be named. They must be named, and they must be named and shamed. And they need to suffer the consequences of their actions. So Mr. Speaker, I have the great fortune and privilege of representing a patriotic and vibrant Venezuelan American community in southern Florida. They continue to bring the attention to these deplorable conditions, those in Venezuela, while the vast majority of the international community, that some would like us to yield to their wishes, but yet they're not saying anything. The Venezuelan people are standing up, in many cases dying in the streets, and the vast majority of the international community is silent. So some would have us just also be silent. Well, with the passage of this bill, the United States House of Representatives will send a strong signal that we stand in solidarity with the Venezuelan people as they struggle to regain democracy, to regain their freedom from the Maduro regime. This House, the United States of America, the People's House, stands with them. So I urge the support of my colleagues on this common sense resolution. I know that I keep hearing, I've heard a little while ago, people that I greatly respect, well, but not all Venezuelans support sanctions. No, the regime doesn't support the sanctions. But this House, led by this leader, right here sitting next to me, was instrumental in strengthening sanctions against Iran when a lot of the international community was against it. And frankly, when the administration, our own administration, was lukewarm at best. But this House stood firm. This House stands for freedom and democracy. And today, once again, this House can stand proudly, side by side, with those who are giving their all in the streets of Venezuela to regain their freedom, their sovereignty, and their dignity. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge the support of this important legislation, and I yield back the remaining part of our time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Florida yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 4587 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4028 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4028, a bill to amend the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 to include the desecration of cemeteries among the many forms of violations of the right to religious freedom.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Ross-Layton, and the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ming, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on this bill.
Objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the Speaker. The fundamental freedom to practice the religion of one's choosing is a fundamental right and an essential element of democratic governance. Religious organizations of all kinds view their cemeteries, Mr. Speaker, as hallowed ground, deserving of respect and protection. Freedom of religion includes the right to gather at these sacred sites and to pay our respects to the beloved faithful who have gone before us. Yet in many places around the world, the desecration of religious cemeteries is an ongoing problem, sometimes through vandalism by intolerant groups, sometimes by construction or demolition without proper consultation of religious authorities. For example, Mr. Speaker, earlier this month, more than 50 graves were vandalized in a Jewish cemetery in northeast Hungary. Their headstones toppled and smashed. I was proud to be an original co-sponsor of a similar effort by former Congressman Robert Turner last Congress, and I want to commend the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Meng, for her leadership in introducing H.R. 4028 this year. The International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which this bill modifies, guides U.S. policy in promoting freedom of religion around the world. Among other aspects, that law requires the State Department to report annually on violations of religious freedom abroad. By adding desecration of cemeteries to the examples of religious freedom violations listed in that act, H.R. 4028 says loudly and clearly that Congress and the American people stand in staunch opposition to the deliberate desecration of religious burial grounds. In this way, the bill provides extra incentives for foreign governments to respect the rights of religious organizations regarding cemetery preservation. In addition to Ms. Meng, I also want to recognize the important contributions of the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, during the Foreign Affairs Committee markup of this bill.